Good morning.
Buenos días.
Oh, hola.
¿Cómo está? Okay, ask me no more.
Oh, that reminds me of this great scene in Family Guy. I think he's on a plane, but Peter, the main character, the dad, he's like on a plane or whatever, going to Mexico or something, and the flight attendant asks him some question in Spanish, and it's some like long question, right? And then he like responds in Spanish, and then there's like one more thing where he comes back, and then after that he just like blinks and he's like, I only know that these two very oddly specific things,
Yeah.
but I know nothing else in Spanish.
That's about right. Yeah, I was watching Mythic Quest the other night, and of course, the creative director in the episode is kind of got a Napoleon complex. Short guy that has to be the alpha and
Nice.
everything, and it's really funny. And bumps into this guy who's like 6'5", and of course, like as he walked into the office, he was talking Spanish with this lady. And then he, goes over to his desk, and then the guy asks him this really long question once again, and if you know any Spanish, you could kind of pick up on the context that he was
Right.
talking about Gabriel Marquez's Thousand Years of Solitude or something. And so you kind of go, and then of course the creative director blanks out and he goes, "No, I don't speak Spanish. I know those three sentences, and we just do that routine every morning so that I look good."
That's funny.
Yeah, he wants to look bilingual without actually being bilingual.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, I find this to be like, yeah, that's about my introduction to Spanish. That's the level I'm at. Is I want to look like I'm bilingual, but
Oh, that was very good. With the whole
thanks.
Buenos Dias thing.
But
You
thank
really,
you, thank you.
there's something about faking it till
Yeah,
you make it, or
yeah.
just faking it forever, right?
It's just that is actually my goal for next year is to pick up a second language. I've done Spanish where I've gotten decent and then I fall behind and then I get decent again and I fall behind. So I think next year I'm going to do another push.
Yeah, so that's for me. So my last name's Garcia, as you know, and I'm actually a quarter Mexican. But yet my grandpa married a very American white lady, and and then raised the family in Mississippi. So there wasn't a large need for Spanish.
Yeah, yeah.
And so my grandpa doesn't even speak Spanish anymore. He did when he was a little kid. But after that, it's like, in America, what's the point, right? But he, anyways, so I didn't learn any Spanish from my family, but I did learn some in high school. But I want to become fluent. What I would say, I'm conversational right now. Like I can get across anything I want to get across, and I can understand what someone else is trying to tell me. I may have to ask them to either slow down or reword it or whatever in certain cases, but for the most part, I could follow. Now, if it's like the super fast, especially like as a lot of Mexican people like to do, talk really, really, really fast, and maybe join some words and maybe added some slang, like then it gets a little bit harder.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so I grew up in New Mexico, and if anyone should know Spanish, it's me.
The one state where they
Yeah.
actually have Mexico in the name. Come on.
Yeah, I know, so strange. I think there's also something about I remember talking to somebody before who, certain generations of people would ban languages from their house. They didn't want their children knowing their language. They only wanted them knowing English or whatever else.
And
it was
without the accent, ideally.
right. It was a
Yeah.
way to assimilate and be successful. And now all the people the children that went through that are like, oh, I missed out on such an opportunity. And the parents were like, I did you a huge blessing. And I find that sort of shift to be pretty strange, like how our societies have shifted back the opposite direction now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, you know, my the typical when you think of like someone who's at least in America or at least in popular media, the most popular kind of I don't know trope is a guy or a girl who's partially black, partially white, and they like try and they don't pass for either type of thing,
Right,
right?
right.
Well, or doing judging people by their names and things like that,
Oh,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So when my parents moved here in the late '80s or something in the Dallas area, when they were calling places to, hey, we're looking for an apartment or whatever, they got a lot of no's over the phone, and then they would go into those places later on and be like, automatically you guys have some vacancy now. You guys are available because your last name is Garcia, so we decided that we couldn't. So it's like,
Oh, man.
yeah. So some of those things before it's like, but then when they show up with their pretty white faces, things change.
Oh, that kind of hurts.
Yeah,
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 yeah. But what can you do? That's kind of how
yeah,
it happens sometimes, right? And
yeah.
even with like resumes and getting jobs and things like that, that's a thing about putting your name on there, and now in this world, there's a question of, oh, do I put a picture or not? And it's like,
Oh,
oh,
right.
me personally, like from the thinking people are good and hoping people are good and all that kind of stuff. It's like, oh yeah, definitely have a picture. Makes it more personable. You know who it is. But then me knowing how animalistic we are and all the bad wiring we have and all the biases that kick in even without us knowing it, it's like, I don't know, maybe it's not a picture.
Yeah, yeah, and that's there was a thing for a while where it was kind of like, and I might be going too far on this, but there was this kind of form I was filling out, and it was asking me, and this happens with a lot of artist grants and artist opportunities, is they ask you a whole bunch of questions about sexual orientation, preference, gender. Of course, how do you identify? And you don't have to answer any of these things. But I also was thinking, you're probably telling them a lot by not answering these things.
Yeah.
Because the people probably choosing not to answer these things might be thinking it's not so much privacy, but in that I might be hurt, or this would be held against me to answer these questions honestly.
Yeah.
But then again, if you get the grant or whatever, or the submission, then you're like, well, they're gonna know anyway.
Well,
So,
yeah.
so I'm kind of like, there's this little weird set of hoops that we're now jumping through that I maybe they existed before. I remember I'm something like a 64th Native American. It's so little it doesn't even really matter, but I think it was enough to actually be included into some sort of class action judgments and suits and things like that. So my parents were like, always put this down on that you're Native American or whatever, and I'm like, but I'm not.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting thing, right? Because you just like a lot of people, and I would say me too. Like 1/64th is not very much, but then when it's like, oh well, seeing as that entire race or whatever you want to call it, ethnicity, I don't know the correct term for
Yeah.
that, but was largely wiped off of the planet. It's like, oh well, maybe those smaller fractions are a little bit more important because
Right.
it was a smaller pool to come from, right? That was one thing. I was just listening to a podcast last week where it was talking about the smallpox vaccine, and it was talking about how it was weaponized back then,
Oh yes.
and how
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, let's just give them these like dirty blankets and things like that, and
Yeah,
then
and they
it's like, oh,
actually put smallpox on the blankets.
right,
I mean, it's the most horrendous kind of warfare. I mean, there's just oh
and it was like something like 90% of the population or something.
yeah, they just
crazy
get
like that.
decimated by a disease.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's really pretty disgusting the way some of that worked out. Is like, here's the gift, and this gift will kill you. I mean, it's horrible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Not only was it that I forget the technical term for it, but using a sickness or illness as a warfare, but then it was under the guise of a gift. It was that's bad. But the other one I wanted to talk about was, as you're saying that, it made me think of the census, which at least with the grants and stuff, people have some incentive. They get some benefit from sharing that information about themselves, right? Well, with the census, it's a problem too, especially here in Texas, is like, undocumented people, and it's like, oh, I don't want to participate in this because I'm worried about the government finding me and kicking me out and all those kind of things. Even though there are laws and protections and stuff in place to prevent that, it's just literally supposed to be information gathering. That stuff can't be held against you, things like that. But one, like, why is it worth the risk? And two, in case of some of these people, like maybe their English isn't the best either. And then three, why would they trust them anyways, right? Especially coming from a place like Mexico, where there is historically some sort of distrust with the government and authority already.
Right, right. And there's, sort of rampant corruption as the norm in certain countries. And that's just the way they operate. And the premise that I've heard is it's like, well, I'm a government official and we don't make any money. So our only way to actually make a living is to take bribes or something like this.
Interesting.
And this becomes, and when that's built into the entire society, then you just start going like, oh man, like this is, it's like tipping your waiter, but like you tip the cops, you tip the congressman, you tip, everybody.
Yeah, well, it's funny because someone was just telling me the other day about they had a friend of a friend or something had some sort of, they were Mexican, they had some family in the Mexican government or whatever, and it's like, oh yeah, our uncle gets kidnapped by the cartel every month. But that's just so they can get the bribe. I'm like, well, why don't they just set up the the money?
I know.
Like, can they
You
just
just
take
do a
out?
Venmo. Can you not inconvenience me? I'll
Right.
go ahead and give you the money. Yeah, I know. That's really funny too, because it's still like once it becomes that transactional, then it's kind of like the guys that are doing all the robbing are like, well, this isn't fun anymore.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's funny, but it's a good transition to our topic for today, which is going to be talking a little bit about travel, a little bit of vacation, a little bit about marketing and consumerism and things like that. But yeah, because one of the things I was saying about the Mexican who had the government official in the cartel, where it's like, I don't know the entire full story, but based on the way it was told to me, it didn't sound like that person's life was in danger or anything like that, because it become this regular thing. But yet now that person who's involved is like, well, I'm never going to go to Mexico because the cartel kidnaps people, and it's like, well, I mean, there's a difference between that and oh, by the way, that person is involved in the Mexican government, so therefore the chance, and they're regularly getting paid. Was extortion is the word,
Yes,
right?
yes,
They're being
yes.
extorted, so naturally, if they're regularly being extorted, that puts them at a higher risk for that type of thing than, for example, an average tourist going to a touristy area that is very safe, right? But yet people use this extrapolation, and it's like, oh, I'm never going to this entire country now because of that one thing in that one area.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it also speaks to what is it, that availability kind of thing, where we pull from the thing that's immediate knowledge, and then we base our decisions
Yeah.
around it. And this seems to be something that happens quite a bit. But yeah, Mexico's great. I've been several times. I've been shaken down a couple of times. Usually for the equivalent of $20. The cabbie is upset. It's something like that. And then they'll say, well, I'll go to the police. And then the thing is with the police is then you have to have more money when they get involved.
Yeah.
And it just like, it keeps going. And so there is this kind of premise, though, that they also don't want to run you off. They don't want to.
It's in their best interest to keep you alive and
Yes.
safe, because they just want a little
And they
bit of
don't
money
actually
from you.
want to take
Yeah.
you to the station. They don't actually want to do any of these things. So it's a sort of an intricate game or a dance. There's this kind of balance that gets played. Of course, there's also horror stories that come out of this.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know where I land on any of that. It's kind of, it's also kind of strange when you go to a foreign country and there's, what seem to be police, but it's actually military walking around with AK-47s or ARs or something like this. And you're just like, whoa, like,
Hey.
how safe is this place, right? But I remember being in Mexico and seeing that. And in Mexico, it was like, wow, this is scary. Go to Barcelona, we're in Spain, same thing. And I was just like, oh, okay, come to Texas. That's just a random dude.
That's just church on a Sunday.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, no, the gun thing is interesting because, so I just got back from a trip. We're back at the couch.
Live.
Yeah, and so we went to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, which is just east of Knoxville, maybe about an hour or so. And in the airport, as we were coming back from Knoxville, they have all these signs, little pictures, and it said, Officer Smith prevented this gun from going on the plane 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, really? What's the point? And it shows a picture of like the gun and the ammo, and I'm like, okay, how many of these? And there's like a bunch of these pictures, and they're all from like within the last month or something like that. I'm like, I'm pretty sure those people probably just forgot their gun in their bag or on their person or whatever. It's not like they're like, you're really keeping us that much safer by doing that. And I was like, what is the point of that? Like, what are you going for there? I didn't get it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pushback that, there has been a movement that, and we don't need to go too far down this rabbit trail, but the idea of the citizen militia, so to speak, where all these citizens are the ones that are going to defend against the next 9/11 or whatever else it is. And it's interesting to think about. The TSA is always a hassle to get through. And so they have to keep sort of validating that, yes, indeed, we are doing our jobs. But you've probably seen some of the stats that come out, and I think they miss like 78% of attempts to get through with things. So when they're tested, they sort of fail miserably, even though they create so much hardship for everybody. And so there is this idea of like, well, why do you still exist? and if you aren't actually accomplishing your purpose. And one of the things that come up with or thought about before is that it's a fantastic employment system. So we have so many people that are now employed by the government through TSA. I think it'd be really hard to unwind that entire system. It's also ends up saying the thing of like, okay, we're all safe again. How do you do that 20 years after 9/11?
Right, in a crazier and less just and
Yeah.
everything's worse kind of world.
Yeah.
How can you do it?
How can you do this? Yeah, that's one of the funny things is people tended to not give up control once they've got that control in place. But also there's a lot of things when we're talking about traveling. My wife tried to come over to Italy to see me a few years ago when I was over there working on a project, and her passport was rejected. And she was like, but it's not expired yet. And they're like, yeah, but it will be expired within like 90 days.
Right.
And she's just like, but it's not, like, expiration dates are expiration dates. And they're like, yeah, we don't allow you to travel 90 days before it's expired into Italy. And she's like, well, why not? And they go, because America does it to us. So now we're doing it back to Americans.
That idea of reciprocity.
Yeah.
No, that's a very, very real thing. That when we were traveling in South America, it's like, all right, go in this country is free. Go into this country, this is free. Go in this country is free. Go into this one country. Oh, it's going to be $120 US. I'm like, what? That's like a year's salary in this country. And I'm exaggerating, right? But it's a very large amount of money.
Yeah.
One for anyone, not anyone, right? But you know what I mean. That's a
When
significant
you're young traveling kids, this is a lot of money.
Yeah, but especially when you compare, the value of the dollar to where that place is, like that money goes a very long way. And it was like, yeah, that's because America charges us for when we get in there.
Yeah, it's so strange that how we think that all these other countries are being unfair to us, but it's our country being unfair in the first place.
Yeah.
And you just go, oh, okay, I guess like this is like the tax of being American when you go anywhere else. Is you have to put up with the way that America treats and bullies other countries as in the way you get treated and bullied. And so, but of course on a lesser degree.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, speaking of travel, have you done a lot of international travel?
Yeah, so I've been to, I think the count is 10 countries, and most of that was on the South America trip I went on with my brother. So we spent 3 weeks, and we went through, I think 4 or 5 countries. It was Peru, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and yeah, I think those were the 4, and that also included the Galapagos Islands, which is part of Ecuador, and that was really cool. That was an awesome trip, and it was very, very beautiful. Lots of really good food, lots of good people, and a really good time. So that was my largest stint of international travel, and other than that, it's been a series of kind of, I'll call them, cruises and resort type of places, right? So various parts of Mexico, and Dominican Republic, and then I could name a couple other I can't think of off the top of my head, but in the Caribbean type of thing where you stop for a day in port or whatnot. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't made the jump over to Europe yet. Excuse me, but that's on the list. That was one of the, hey, maybe in 2020 we'll go do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we're still looking to plan that one. And yeah, I'd love to go at least to every continent. I'm probably not going to make every country in the world, but I enjoy it very much. And Mexico City was really cool, and very accessible too. From it was like $200 flight or something like that. Back when I got it from LA, and that was before COVID. I bet right now I'd be surprised if it's even cheaper. Or especially from Dallas. I'm sure there's plenty of travel between Dallas and Mexico.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I've never been to Mexico City, but I watch, you watch movies, you see things, you're just like, this is a great place. And considering I've probably been to Mexico a dozen times, maybe more, then it's silly for me not to have been to Mexico City. So I find that to be shocking. But yeah, it's because the tourist flight towns to the, you go to the beaches and they have a package deal set up, and it just makes it all easy. And it's almost always where your friends want to go anyway. Like most of my friends are not like Mexico City. Most of them are like, no, like let's go to, whatever, Puerto Vallarta. or something like
Right.
this, and then we just go sit on a beach
Yeah,
or something.
Cancun or
Yeah, yeah,
Cozumel or whatever, all those
right.
places. And I mean, one, that's because those places are built to cater towards that audience, and they're
Mm-hmm.
kind of you know I don't know the official designation, so have some grace with me here, audience. But there's the designation, right? First world country, second world country, third world country. Another term that's used is a developing country, right? And where the countries are in our mind is one very different than where they actually are, and then of course what we think and perceive and how things look is of course different than the technical definitions, right? But as an American coming from extremely pretty and well developed and designed areas with the roads are all very nice. The buildings are all built to very specific code, and not just that, but they're all themed in a certain way, right?
Right, right.
And it's all like super very looking a specific way. Well, then you go to some of these other countries, especially like in Latin America, and it's like, oh, it looks kind of like run down, kind of has that
Mm-hmm.
feel, and it's like, oh, it's just like that's just different, and there are lots of pros and cons that come with that, right? I think more colorful is a term that comes to mind, and also literally a lot of times it is more colorful, which I like much more than just the bricks and the tans and the whites, and
Yeah.
but yeah, and also some of it's like, for example, in a lot of Latin American countries, when people are building a house, or any building, they build the first floor or whatever, and then they just leave the rebar exposed because they're going to expand in the future. And so they actually build the first floor while it's accessible and they can afford it and things like that. And then as the family grows or they make more money or whatever, then they just build up. But because of that, you have these exposed rebar all around. So it's
Yeah.
like, it looks, and obviously just like anywhere else, I'm sure this varies based off where you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. So I kind of like that idea. It's like, oh, wait, an accessible home that people can afford and have the ability to grow. Like, that's nice, but you got to look at the rebar. So pros and cons, right?
Yeah, right. No, it's one of the tenets of architecture is to actually, when you're planning a house, you're building an office, a shop, whatever the heck it is be thinking of expanding in the future and leave openings and spaces for that to happen. I mean, that's what good architecture is supposed to do, which, by the way, is how you know you're living in cookie cutter homes in the suburbs when that does not exist for you.
Right.
Right. So, because they've already maximized out everything to the nth degree. But, there's also something about that rebar sticking up and everything where I'm sure here it would just be against zoning ordinance or
Right.
against code, so you'd have to trim all that off. So we sort of don't allow for these options. And I was thinking about this weekend because, as y'all know, if you've been listening, then I've got a shop built at my place now, but I'm also building out some stuff on the interior. And what's fascinating is every attempt that I've kind of had to try to be creative within building this shop has kind of been thwarted by the economics of it. So any kind of attempt to sort of really be creative, to make something slightly different, to do this, to do, well, what if I don't put this on the side wall? What if I put this here? What if oh, well, you can do that, but it will just cost X. What if you don't build in a perfect rectangle? Oh, well, that will cost this, right? And all of a sudden the costs just start going through the roof. And so every time that I tried to be creative, it ended up getting thwarted by sort of rational efficiency. And I found that to be sort of interesting to think that to be creative requires a tremendous push in our current environment. So anyway, we could talk about all that later, but it was just a little epiphany that landed
Yeah.
on me.
No, no, I like that, and we can talk about it a little bit too. Because what was popping in my mind was how, yes, I actually was talking about this the other day, because I was saying how one of the nice things about Europe, or South America, is the architecture when you go to these places. And
Yeah.
some of that's because the places are so old that you get to see these buildings, these walls, these whatever, these things that have been built a really long time ago in this very particular way. And a lot of it very labor intensive and expensive. And it's like, we will never see buildings built like that again because of
Yeah.
that very reason that you're talking about, because it's too expensive and people have all these construction techniques, and but yeah, they're willing to say, oh, this building is probably going to start falling apart around 30 years, or at least need some changes or work. But that's not, it doesn't justify the cost for us to make one that could last, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of years like some of these traditional ones.
Yeah, a really big shift. And one thing is that also, of course, a lot of these buildings that are classic that will last for thousands of years are funded by government or the church. So these institutions that have a vested interest in sticking around that long. So there's also sort of a incentive idea behind some of this too. But one of the things that we could talk about a little too when you get into travel is how unique America is for its architecture. And it can seem very much like throwaway architecture, that it's not meant to last for long periods of time. So even when you're talking about rebar sticking out of something, that means it's made out of either, cinder blocks or concrete or something that's going to last for a while. So these houses are actually built to be hurricane proof or whatever else in these various areas, and they want them to last. In America, we do a lot of things out of wood frame construction, and
Yeah.
some of that can last, but it also has a tendency to have to be touched up and rebuilt and have other issues. There is a guy, Umberto Eco, who is, I think, European. I think he's French, I want to say. But he came back. He came through America in the 80s and was just blown away by everything that he saw here. And the book is called Travels in Hyperreality. Because it's one of the interesting things he talks about there. And then I want to sort of maybe touch on him a little bit and then talk about Venturi Brown's book, Learning from Las Vegas, in which they point out this kind of idea of building a shed,
Uh-huh.
like just a white box out of the cheapest material possible, and then declaring it to be a church by putting a sign on it that says church or putting a cross on it is a very American thing. In Europe, you actually build a church that looks like a church.
A
The shape,
shrine.
well, yeah,
You know,
the
something that's
shape of the church tells you that it's a church. But in America, we build boxes and we claim them to be something by putting a sign on them, which is just mind blowing for anyone from these old world countries. They're like, no, no, the form follows the functions. Churches look like this, soccer stadiums look like this, homes look like this, and they kind of have this architecture that's centered around the purpose of the thing. But in America, we just build boxes and label them. And this also gets into the superficiality. So when I was talking about Umberto Eco's travels in hyperreality, there is a symbolic collapse where in America we lean into the pattern and the symbol, we lean into the abstraction and do everything else as cheap as possible. And of course, this also ties into Protestant work ethic, and the economics of saving and appearing to be frugal is championed in America.
yes.
So, and yet you're frugal on one end so that you can go buy a boat and a lake house on the other.
Right.
So it's this real trade off.
Well, that's a really interesting point, especially the tend towards frugality or whatever, because, at least I would say at least anecdotally, but that's just because I don't have the stats in front of me. But I've heard lots and lots of examples of it in media about how it doesn't matter, if someone has millions and millions of dollars or if they're scraping by. Like, obviously there's different personalities and mindsets around money, but I've heard plenty of people, licking the silver spoon who are still talking about getting a deal, right? Or it's like, and there's plenty of companies that lean into it super hard. One of the good examples here in America is a company called Kohl's, and there's literally nothing is ever full price. Like it's always, and it's not just a percentage, little percentage off. It's always like 40% or 70% off, right? And then it's like, oh, well, if you come in today, like we'll give you $20 of Kohl's cash, and they have like all of these. It's just all marketing and psychology, and it's like you just walk in and I've heard many people say like, oh well, especially I would be surprised as how it started was, here's how you justify it to your man when you get home,
Yeah.
after you buy the thing.
I got all this at 50%
Yeah,
off.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
It was 70, but now it's only 35, and it's like, oh my gosh, it just hurts my head.
It's still $35 though.
Yeah.
Like yeah, but there's it was the same. I did this brief stint working in Michael's, the sort of alternate to
Crafts
Hobby
and-
Lobby.
yeah.
Yeah. And I worked in the frame shop there. And I had worked in a previous frame shop that was like a real frame shop that did stuff for galleries and everything else, and the shift going to Michael's was sort of insane, but also nothing was ever, if anyone ever paid full price, I just ethically couldn't handle it, and I was like, there's a coupon, just always trying to like point them into any sort of resource, because you come in on a certain day and all of the canvases to make paintings on are 50% off. So the idea that you would pay full price there ever was sort of It just sort of a joke.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're pulling it over on lots of people. But then also the people that are regulars there, they feel like they're regulars because they have this like inside knowledge.
Yeah.
And so
A lot of layers with that one, huh?
yeah, I'm kind of curious about this inside knowledge too when it comes to things like traveling, because everyone that goes, we're talking about going to these resorts in Mexico, and you feel like you're getting this really good deal, this inside deal, and that's leading you to keep going to these resorts. Or when you go to Vegas, people get these like perks from
Yeah.
continuing to go back over and over again.
Well, that also gets into another one which we can touch on or not, which is just the frequent flyer or the frequent traveler type of programs, right? Which one of the things that they give you, one of the things they afford you is this status and this like in group, and then especially if you happen to be traveling with people, you can be like, oh hey, you guys are with me today, so we can go over to the lounge, I'm special and I'm in
Yeah.
because I've got this lounge access. Don't matter that I either paid an annual price to get into this or the fact that I've just spent so much money overall that this company is willing to give me a little bit. Don't pay no mind to
Yeah,
that.
yeah. It is funny, and then it's after you've flown, I don't know, every other week for 6 or 7 months, then all of a sudden you get sort of upgraded, and you're always flying sort of first class or whatever it is, and you have access, you get free Wi-Fi, you get all these sort of perks if you stay loyal to this company, and yeah, we're kind of a sucker for this idea of giving away things for free. And I was listening to this podcast this weekend, and a marketing guy was talking about how if you walk, they ran these experiments where somebody would walk into a McDonald's, and if they gave them a balloon for free, then the family that was given the balloon would spend 12% more than an average family on food.
Wow.
So the idea that you give somebody a little keychain, you give them something like that would work. And then what some people were doing was actually giving people a free piece of food, some sort of sample ice cream, something when they walked in the door. And everyone else was, some certain people were like, well, don't give them food if they came there to buy food because they need to be spending their money on your food. But those people that you served of an immediate need when they walked in and you gave them food would spend 24% more
Wow.
on food. It's because you solved their immediate need. So they valued that freebie so much that they would spend more money there. So there is a psychology of reciprocity. You brought up reciprocity earlier, but there's an entire psychology to it. We live in a culture that we feel bad to take and not give back. So if certain marketing people do manipulate that tendency.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about one area of travel where I like to give back. And that's when I go to the restroom,
On the plane?
Not on the plane, but yes, on the plane. But I'm actually referring to when you're traveling and you've got to stop to go to the bathroom, right? Well, I just got gas, just not too long ago. I don't need to fill up. So I don't need to spend any money at this place, but I need to use the bathroom.
Yeah.
Do you feel obligated to buy like a pack of gum or a snack or something?
I do. And that's after traveling in Europe where they actually charged me to